everyone to the opportunity to share the work of Marguerite Robichaux and her new exhibition, which is a look backward called A Look Back. The show is now up in the gallery and has been up for about 2 weeks. And the amount of delight that has brought people just in this short time, granted it's winter and cold, and so many of the scenes have a warmth and poetic integrity that it brings people into them, and they spend time in the gallery probably that they didn't intend to spend, simply being surrounded by and nourished by the work itself. So we're happy just to be together, to have an opportunity to share with you various perspectives as we go along. Our normal procedure is to start with the cover of the catalog, which we will, I hope. Carolyn, if we can look at it, thank you. And to let you know that we will be coming back to this painting that is somewhat divided by the title of the exhibition, but also to invite you to, if you have questions or responses, to do it in the chat room, and Caroline can share the questions or responses with us as we go through. It's an opportunity also to have wonderful perspectives of others who are in the art world, have been in the art world, and are interested in continuing to add to the conversation. A longtime friend of Marguerite's, Hope Hilton, is with us. Mara Williams, for many of you who have been on other webinars with us, know and appreciate her extraordinary capacity to help us see the work better. I'm also asking Caroline to chime in if she feels like it along the way, and of course Marguerite. So let's look at the first piece, and with it, let me just share, as I frequently do, one of Thomas's quotes, which is, "Art is something seen about something unseen." And Marguerite, if you could speak a bit about not only the place and the process, but also, if you would, in a sense, about intention.
Well, first of all, Bernie, I want to say thank you for anyone who's watching. Thank you and Sue and the staff at Pucker for putting all this together, and for our panelists, Hope and Mara, to join us. It's a pleasure to show at Pucker, and the beautiful catalog that is produced has all of these images within it. This particular image from 1989 is a very early, large work of mine. I started, my first medium was watercolor, and I went to several artist residencies back in the late 70s, early 80s, and was able to scale up the small watercolors that I did on plein air into large oils. Now, first I did them on paper, large oils on paper, and using a technique like watercolor, I painted in oils, thin paint, translucence. The white in the painting is actually the gessoed surface of the paper or the canvas, and they're drippy and loosely done. I was working with painting the landscape as a physical being. It's almost like treating the landscape as a human figure. These early works are pretty much flat on the surface of the painting. I don't paint figures. I take out the telephone poles. I take out most man-made inferences, and they're pure landscape, which I think describes so much of our experience, especially the rural or wilderness experience that I live in Maine most of the year, and the pockets of Louisiana that I spend some time in, where I grew up. This painting, as I said, is early and is large, and from this painting, I delved into still large works, but also I continued to do the small watercolors that informed the large pieces.
Hope, would you respond to it just a bit in terms of how you see the painting and experiencing it?
Well, for me, it's a very familiar landscape because it's much of Maine, which is heavily forested, but it has these pockets that have been opened up for farmland and farm area. And Marguerite, I don't know if this is a Maine piece or Vermont.
It's actually Maine, but it's influenced by Vermont when I was over there at the residency. That, you know, artistic license, I can take one place and make it into another. It's a pretty generic road into the hills and forests. It can be either, actually.
Well, for the viewer, it's very mesmerizing and restful at the same time. Excuse me. So it's easy to stare at it for quite a while. I suppose one could use it as a mantra or a piece if one is doing restful thinking. It works like that. And it doesn't get old for me, these pieces that I see them and then I don't see them and see them again, and they're just as fresh as the first time I looked at them.
It's a lovely way to see any kind of art, that it remains pertinent and part of your world each time you encounter it. And Mara, can you share with us some of your thoughts about it?
Yes, I'd like to go back to Marguerite's idea of landscape as a human body. And part of this is there's a place in Vermont, Guilford, Vermont, just south of me, and there's something about how the land opens up there, the soft rolling hills. The hills here are much older than, say, the Rockies. We were scoured out in the last ice age, but in here you have this sort of soft, pillowy flesh. So it's like when you start at the bottom of the canvas, you start with the very edges of the bottom where she hasn't filled the sheet, so that you've got the curve of a thigh or a buttocks, the land, but it sits as a figure. It doesn't go edge to edge and become a picture plane. And all along the edges of this piece of paper that has then been adhered to a board, you actually see the curve of the brush, the curve of the artist's hand coming around and sort of holding the flesh of this land, the volume of this land. And yet you're still fully aware that it is a depiction, that it is a painting, that it has its own physicality beyond the illusion. So I just, the sinuous quality of how this land moves back and forth and then curves around itself and is held by the substructure, or the in this case, paper. It's lovely. But it's like those edges are so exciting to me.
I love it. Marguerite, do you want to respond to that in the context that, since this is relatively early, to speak about your own journey and why you are an artist?
Well, I started real young. My mother bought me an easel when I was like 7 years old, so I knew I was going to be an artist. And like I said, back then it was tempera paints, but watercolor was really my early medium. And to reflect upon what Mara was talking about, I'm often asked about my work with its drips and the edges that are always exposed. Early on, I quit matting watercolors over the edge or framing oil paintings over the edge and leaving the edge exposed, because I feel like there's a lot of tension that happens on the edges of paintings. And to take that away deprives the viewer of seeing the hand of the artist, and it respects the integrity of the material itself.
Absolutely. Caroline, do you have any thoughts as we move on to the next one?
Yes, I do. Well, a couple things chime in what Marguerite said, that to respect the material, that's like the sculptor's heart. But I do feel like all of Marguerite's work, which is, it is oil that she uses media to water down. It has that spirit of watercolor. So it's so transparent, but for me, all the scenes I just fall into. I just fall into them. I see the human figures in them, but for me, it's just, I fall into them like they almost have this fairy tale quality, but then there's this push and pull between almost the sculptural element of like having the paper and the edges breaking into this scene, and they're just lovely. They're really kind of inspiring, and like Hope said, you can really just kind of sit and play and stare at them for a really long time, especially these really big ones that you can almost feel like you're falling into.
And the next one, which we'll be looking at, also provides us with the pathway, not quite as sinuous, but moving off way into the distance. But somewhat, 15 years later, Marguerite, what happened in the work itself in that decade and a half?
Well, during that time, I became a little more, the image became a little more realistic, more extensive brushwork, more extensive planning on the disappearing road into the horizon. This particular piece was one of a series that I did after Hope and I made a trip to the county, which is a rustic county up in northern Maine that is largely agricultural. It's just beautiful landscape, and endless vistas off into the horizon. The difference here is that there's just more intense drawing in this, and I have a real intensive background. I'm a good draftsman. I took drawing in school. I was a printmaker in graduate school. I worked as a technical illustrator in Houston when I got out of college. So I can draw anything really, which is good in most ways, because often I'll do a complete graphite drawing beneath a painting, just mostly to see where I want my light values and dark values. But over the course of these 15 or so years from that first painting, I just incorporated more drawing, more graphic material into the paintings, while still treating the material as it's almost like a watercolor writ large.
I remember that there were a number of pieces in past shows where the pencil marks of the outline still were visible. It seems to me in most of the pieces in this exhibition that isn't the case, that you've created the structure either with the graphite underneath it, but you've also covered it over, and that may be just a matter of happenstance and the works you chose, or it's the way, or you're working slightly differently today. I don't know which.
Well, it's over the years, sometimes the pencil marks show more. The graphite is not soluble in turpentine, but you can use turpentine on a graphite drawing. It kind of lifts the particles of graphite, spreads them around, so you get a tone rather than a line. And then in order to paint over it with turpentine thinned oil, you have to fix the graphite drawing with a fixative before painting over it, or you just spread that graphite all over it, becomes muddy. So sometimes when it's fixed and I start painting, I have in the past left them as just graphite drawings in some cases, but once I would put any color at all on a graphite drawing, it dulled the graphite right down. So I would continue to paint and cover up the graphite. If it's just graphite, the lights and darks have a definite life of their own. But once you put color on there, it becomes sort of a gray tone.
Melds into it. Mara, thoughts about this, and both in relation to the former piece and also on its own?
Again, the edges on this, straight up and down the sides are just magnificent. It's almost like the painting has a decal. to the edge. It feathers out at the edge, and you have that push between image and plane, and image and plane. This one, of course, is sort of much more rectilinear. It's much more definition of those fields as an agricultural field. It's not this sort of soft and mounded, rounded shape. It's much more like when you go see where row crops are or where cornfields are. But that also gives the whole painting almost the structure of a quilt, because agricultural fields do sort of quilt the land. And so I like I can understand that these started with this beautiful graphite drawing, and I'd love to see, I happen to have a thing for drawings, and particularly graphite drawings. Just love the shimmer of the graphite. So I'd love to see some of your drawings. But it does have that hand of a fine draftsman underneath. I mean, it is painterly, but it does have the hand, the integrity of a fine draftsman underneath it, and that's very exciting to me.
Hope, some thoughts?
We drove around Aroostook County, and we'd stop and look at fields, and this would have been based on going down a side road and stopping and asking the farmer if we could take pictures of his fields, which just delighted these guys. Coming across the field from their tractor to these two broads in a car, and us asking politely if we could take pictures, it just thrilled them. It didn't take long, staying a couple nights in the county, when the word was out that these two strange women were driving around looking at fields in Aroostook County. We were very well received wherever we stopped.
How wonderful. That's a wonderful tribute to, I guess, Mainers, as well as to the interest you bring to what is theirs, and wanting to share it. Wonderful, wonderful. Can we look where the work is made, Caroline? Marguerite, this is your space, so you should speak about it.
This is my studio, which is part of my home in Maine. The photograph is by David Etnier, a famous Maine photographer who has done a series of photographs of artists in their studios. He did a series 25 years ago of 10 or 12 artists, and he decided to continue it this past year, doing some artists like my age. But this studio space was designed especially to be a studio. It's got 32-foot ceiling with north light, concrete floor, shelving that's off camera. And my wall is covered with, it's a material called Celotex. It's like a soundboard, but I paint flat. I paint on canvas that is stretched flat against the wall, stapled down, and I don't stretch it on stretcher bars until after it's done. And because I paint so thinly, I'm able to handle a painting. It's not like it's thick impastoed paint that would crack if I rolled it or bent it. And I put canvas and paper on the wall to paint. And of course you can see all the mess of a studio on the table, and my easel, and the floors covered with Q-tips because I use those a lot in my painting. And of course, there's a chair to sit in to contemplate the work at the end of the day.
Wonderful. Mara, any thoughts about a space in which one works?
I love an artist studio, and of course, how lucky to have northern light to paint in. I mean, that's just every artist's dream. I'm always fascinated. I mean, I see your work dotted around, but usually, and it might be in the books on the table, usually I find an inspiration wall. There might be a Vermeer in there if that's a particular brushstroke you like, or a Dura for the draftsman in you, or bits and bobs of seashells. And every artist just has that place that's sort of their inspiration wall. I wonder where yours is.
There's over near that window on the side, there's a Joan Mitchell, a Vermeer, you're right. A Sean Scully,
Oh,
uh,
yes.
torn out of art magazines and just push pinned to the wall. I also use, I'll take images out of magazines and use them to line my drawers of my tool chest. I just
Well,
run
that's
out of
fun.
space to put them on the wall. And most paintings have a little talisman over them on the wall. I have a piece of a deer tail. I have a crow's feather. I have a Mardi Gras bead, and I'll put them up for good luck over each one of the paintings I'm working on.
I love it.
that. There's a quote that I wanted to share that I really like a lot, which is aloneness and loneliness are not the same thing. Aloneness is profoundly metaphysical, a consciousness we are never far from the edge of existence, and that you work by yourself. Is that distinction helpful to you in terms of both aloneness and loneliness?
I can't ever remember being lonely. I have spent a lot of my life alone. I have dear friends. I have Walter, my significant other, but I live alone at the end of a long road, and doesn't bother me a bit. I enjoy the time. I can entertain myself. And one of the things that I have found living where I do in Maine is I do not have a community of artists nearby like I would have if I lived on the coast or mid-coast Maine. I don't have artists stopping in the studio to look at a painting and say, uh-oh, you better stop. You know, you've done enough.
Right.
Or things like that. I have to depend upon my own sensibilities to tell me when to work and when to stop, that sort of thing. But I treasure my time alone to do my work and to contemplate and walk in the woods and look at birds and that sort of thing.
Hope, how would you respond to that distinction?
I think it's exactly correct. I think increasingly people are afraid of being alone, and yet it's not something to fear. It's quite a productive period. I work alone in my office here, and I don't have music or other things on. I'm puttering away working. I don't even notice the time passing. So I'm not lonely doing that, nor do I feel alone, even though I am. So everything Marguerite's saying is quite familiar and accurate to me.
And Mara, who spent her life educating people, you require both an audience and a space in which to share what you know and have it responded to, I think, don't you?
Well, I find these Zooms a bit difficult because I don't actually lecture about work. What I ask people is what's happening here, and we talk about it together, and we make meaning together, and the meaning can be different with one group of people coming through the museum or the gallery than another. And it's very fruitful. I'm one of 7 children, and I'm married to a man who's one of 7 children. When I get alone time, I am just so happy. Very public job. I raise a lot of money for the museum and for my other charities. I'm a very social person. So yes, so alone time for me is pretty precious.
And that's very interesting. And I don't think it has to do with a distinction between creative and non-creative, because clearly you're creative in a more social sense. And the artwork of Marguerite and other artists that comes out of their, not isolation, but aloneness, provides us with another kind of richness. So one's not better than the other, but I think they're very distinct. It would be very difficult for us to run a gallery alone. So let's look at the next image if we can. Marguerite, this looks like your desk.
Well, it's the table I do watercolors on, which is
Okay.
which is pretty crowded right now with some photos, some nasturtium seeds that I've saved for replanting, and a donation jar for a charity I'm on, but this is not in my studio. It's up in the living room, kitchen area of my home and looks out over the river that I see, and it's very bright and open, and it's where I do my watercolors.
A nice accumulation, almost neatly stacked, sort of.
Mm.
But it gives a sense of place, I think, which is very, very important for everyone. My desk's the same thing. I'm sure that Mara's desk, if there is one, and so forth, a place where you do feel comfortable sitting, thinking, working, whatever it may be, but it's yours. And this feels very much like it is yours in a wonderful way. Other thoughts before we move on to one of my favorite pieces in the exhibition? Let's do it.
This is an early work again. It's from 89, 90. From a trip to Italy I took with two girlfriends. It's a vineyard in the hills. We were driving from Ravenna to Florence, and again, the road figures minorly in this, but it's the undulating hills and the contour of the landscape defines the areas where the fences roll over the edge of the field, or the vineyard stakes define that space of the field that they're in. Again, this is oil on paper, and it was done denser than the early Vermont work, but still pretty loosely painted, thin, transparent color, idealized shapes of trees rather than detailed drawn trees. So it's still in that genre of the early work where it's pretty stylized.
Mara, your thoughts about this
This
painting?
one is so dramatic to me. I just like what the sky is doing. The fact that it seems to be an overcast day, and yet there is that low slanting light that's hitting the stakes of the vineyard. There's a sense of dramatic beauty, but there's a little bit of a sense of foreboding for me in this, because that far hill looks like an outcropping of some sort. It's just, there's a little bit of menace up there in that top corner. But it's the drama of the light in here that is both the play of that flat gray and some sort of streak of light hitting a field. That's always a magical thing. It happens to the hill that I live on and the view that I have outside my house here. I get that dramatic late afternoon slanting light with the flat gray sky a lot, and it never stops taking my breath away. And this painting captures that magical sense of light and foreboding at once that I just am very drawn to.
We have a very dear friend in Pienza, and every time I see both the contrasts of the greens and the cypress trees, or the suggestion of them, I think my heart and spirit and memory go back to the friendship that we share with her for probably over 25 years. So it becomes the essence of our Italian experience, meaning friendship and openness, light and beauty. And it comes through very much in this piece for me as we look at it. We should move on, but Marguerite, I love this piece, and I just wanted to make sure we highlighted it as we went through.
Bernie, there was one item we didn't mention in that last piece.
Sure.
The fact that in Italy, they tuck those vineyards in on every square inch that they can. And also there's a lot of wind in this piece.
Right, and movement.
The storm moving in, and the trees in the foreground, you feel as though they're, excuse me, moving. They're being blown aside by the wind that is coming through, the storm that's coming through.
Interesting. Yeah, that is also true with the, well, I just remember this row of cypress trees leading up to this particular B&B called Le Traverse. And it all brings back wonderful memories of friendship and of Italy. I must say that there's a different feeling for sure than where we were about to end up back in Vermont, with the other two small pieces adjacent to one another. Each of the works evokes, I think, for any viewer, either memories or a sense of a place where they may have been or they may want to go. So Marguerite, would you begin talking about these, please?
These are small. These are 4 inches square. They're little intimate pieces. And they are actually a more recent than the Italy piece, a lot more recent than that. But they refer back to work that I did before the Italy piece, the one that we started with. I will often revisit a certain style or landscape and paint it again, over and over again. And of course, 20 years later, it's going to be a lot different than it was when I painted it the first time. But this was landscape in Vermont that was just so sensual, and I had done paintings of it quite large. So I decided I would like to do some really tiny, intimate pieces from that landscape.
Other than the fact that you undersold them, because at least the measurements say 6 inches square.
Oh,
Either way, they certainly are different in scale than the others. And I think that, again, the sense of place. Frequently, when we're driving up through New Hampshire and into Vermont, there's a dramatic change, and it's maybe not just a state line between those two states in terms of majesty, power, energy that seems to exist in the Vermont landscape, captured at this small scale, but nonetheless very present, very imposing in a wonderful way. Mara, your thoughts?
Well, someday I'll give you the whole geological lecture on what New Hampshire is versus Maine and Vermont,
Okay.
why it's so very, very different geologically. But what I'd like to comment on this is these are tiny but mighty. There's another one we'll be looking at later, which is a water sort of fall piece. These are 6 by 6 inches, and yet they have the majesty of the big pieces. It's quite a remarkable achievement. Bravo.
Totally agree. Hope, thoughts?
I agree with everything that's been said. And these are pieces that I call candy bars, that they're little, they can be moved around from room to room so that it freshens your eye when you come upon them. The big pieces, once they're in place, they're in place. They're an entire wall, so to speak, but these things are very portable.
And they're non-caloric, which is even better. Let's look.
Right.
Let's look. Pardon me?
I must say, everybody should have a half a dozen.
Okay.
For years, I painted the main landscape, fields, mountains, trees, reflected in still waters of the ponds and lakes in Maine. And I decided I wanted to do running, raging water. So I started doing a whole series of waterfalls. This is a large painting, and it's near my home, which I have hiked by this waterfall before and done several images of it, but it worked. I like the way it works with my style. All that white is, almost all of that white is the gessoed linen. I did use some opaque white paint dripped that looks like the water falling. But basically, the light values in that is just the whiteness of the linen underneath the transparent paint.
Hope, you probably know this area. So what are
Yes,
your...
I do.
Okay, and your thoughts about it?
This piece accurately portrays the noise. It's not something that you recognize the second you look at it, but as you look, you begin to realize the power and force and sound of this water when it's pouring down the side of the hill. So not every piece has sound in it to me, but this one definitely does.
It's a wonderful way to think about it. Mara?
You know, conventional wisdom is you don't put a void in the middle of a painting. So again, just set that right upside down on, you know, it turns it right upside down on the head. I mean, just the central character here is this big churning white void. What I would love is, Carolyn, can you like go in and put the magnifying glass with the plus and just blow this up so it goes off the page, as it were? We won't see the whole image, but I don't know if you can do that on Zoom.
Not while
Yeah.
we're in the slides.
Not while you're in the, then never mind. I just like, I've got my nose about 4 inches away from the screen, and it's just this, the drips that you have added, the slightly grayed off white that gives the power, the sound, the menace, the explosion of water tumbling, both in the white and then across the rocks, where in fact it becomes paint again. You know, the down at the bottom right quadrant. It's just so exciting. It's exciting painting. It's great depiction, but it's exciting painting.
So I should make a small commercial announcement here that people should come and look at the paintings.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
This will not substitute for seeing the work in person and experiencing
Exactly.
just that, the textures and the.
But it's just a nice way to remind people that these are made up images essentially, whereas the works themselves have a surface energy that you're referring to, Mara, in such a wonderful way. Even though it is thinly painted, there's a lot of activity and energy in the surface of the works themselves that only comes through not in reproduction, but in standing in front of or 4 inches away from the painting. The next one's a small waterfall that I think, Mara, you were talking about earlier, and if not, you can talk about it now.
Oh, it's just, you know, again, this is a 4.25 by 6.5. It's basically a postcard size. And where a postcard usually makes an image look very reductive, you know, it's a picture of the Alps, but it's kind of reductive when it's done. This really completely conveys the majesty of the scene and the power of the scene. I just can't express enough to the audience how masterful and magical that is.
Well, I believe you. So,
Or do you believe everything I say?
Marguerite, would you like to respond to the enthusiasm, I would say, at a minimum?
Oh, well, yeah, thank you. The watercolor technique is very obvious in this. I don't paint that ice and water. I paint around it. And by making the rocks dark and that very background sky, trees dark, it really just pushes that whiteness to the surface and makes it the subject. You know, the void in the middle of the painting. And I paint a lot of snow because I live in the in the woods of Maine. But when I was first painting snow, I'd have to look at it, and there's so much color in it. I mean, there's certain times when there's navy blue in it, and there's purple in it, and the shadows turn different colors. And you'll see in this painting that little bit of open water underneath the waterfall itself, where you see the blue, sort of a cerulean blue showing through. I love those touches of color that come out in snow paintings and ice paintings.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because when we were first married living in Jerusalem in 1959-60, and there was so much sun, especially in the summer, the only place where there was color was in the shade. Mm-hmm. So you needed that relief from the intense snow or the intense sun to
Right.
find bits of color. And what you've done here is to distribute them in such a wonderful way that it adds to the energy of the piece and also the dimensionality. And again, to remind people, the scale itself is like very, very small, but it feels enormous, which is, I think, a remarkable ability that comes through this piece. We move back in time, I think, a bit in terms of the pieces to the next one. And Caroline, first of all, you're not going to have many waterfalls like that near Memphis. So keep that in mind, know the snow. But talk a bit about your response to this painting.
Well, I think this is actually probably a good example of what I've been thinking about as we've been talking, is that Marguerite's painting, she has a painterly quality, but it's not, I mean, I think when you think of painterly, it's, you know, big, heavy brushstrokes that have dimension to them. But Marguerite gets so much done with so little. I think it's quite unique, because I think it gives the painting both a sense of meekness, but it really emphasized the strength that is actually defined in the word meek. It's not, there's not a weakness to it, but it's subtle, and it's not loud, but it's so strong. And I think her pieces, that's what's so fairy tale to me, is they're so real, but they're playful, and they remind me what I love about nature, which I think not a lot of people who actually do landscapes can get. This one has probably the most fairy tale in it. It's almost like Midsummer Night's Dream or something, with all those almost eerie, playful limbs and that moon. But it's really quite a sweet painting. And all of them are, but that's kind of, yeah, that's where my head keeps going.
Well, as you're talking, the light seems to pervade the painting itself in a way that it didn't when you began. Marguerite, your thoughts about this?
Well, I like her definition of a fairy tale painting. It's very stylized to me and very romantic, almost like an illustration for a book of children's fairy tales. This particular piece is reminiscent of my backyard in Louisiana, which faces east and is 2 blocks from a big Catholic church, Our Lady of Mercy Catholic Church. And when the moon rises through the jungle that is the backyard, we've always called it the Mercy Moon. It's just very it's very Louisiana to me, and a romanticized Louisiana, not the brutal swamps with critters in it, but
Right.
old backyard.
Mara, how do you see the painting and experience it?
Exactly, Arthur Rockham couldn't have done it better. This is very into the woods feeling about it. But what I'd like to comment on is how from that moon she builds light through the center of the canvas, and then it seems to extend into that blue heaven. It's low light, but it's very present light. And the other thing I'd like to remark on is this really shows your ability as a draftsman.
Mm-hmm.
Very much so. Hope?
I wouldn't have used Caroline's word of meek. I would say it's very understated elegance and power. And it takes a minute to realize that's what's going on. It's a very elegant piece.
Hope has traveled with me in Louisiana, and we've been down in the swamps. This is pretty stylized version of the swamp.
Mm-hmm.
Let's look at the next one then and see if we get to the swamps better. Is that more what we would expect?
This is more like being in a pirogue in the middle of the bayou. It's drippy and raw, and it's much more loosely painted. It's a larger painting than the previous Mercy Moon, and it's a later piece. So I was being really loose with the application of the paint, putting paint down, wiping it away, letting it drip, wiping that away, dripping it more. So it's more typical of what you might feel if you were out on the water in a bayou.
Absolutely. And Mara?
Marguerite, that blue towards the bottom of the piece really is a great contrast with the otherwise mossy browns and greens. It tracks up through the channel there and up to the sky. It really provides wonderful contrast.
Mara?
Well, again, it's your interplay of darks and lights. It's just beautiful. With this one, it's a very tight, color range. You've got this sort of umber brown, a bark form that is reiterated, of course, in the reflection. But then there's this leafy green that's juxtaposed against a deeper mossy green. And then there's just this beautiful blue of the sky, which becomes a little more troubled blue, not only in terms of its movement, but in terms of its tone, in the swampland, the waterway, what is that called? What is the water thing called? Wetlands. That's it. I knew there was a word there I was missing. But there's a delicacy of this blue and leaf green against the dark tones that I'm just enchanted with.
Marguerite, how do you negotiate this in a boat when you're there?
Yes, out in a pirogue or a canoe.
Okay.
Or from the shore. I'm deathly afraid of snakes, so I'm real careful about going out into landscape like this.
Got it. All right. Well, I certainly would second that motion. Let's look at the next image.
This is a shot of that I took in my studio. I often work on more than one piece at a time in the studio, and the one on the lower right one is the one that's on the cover of this catalog that we'll look at in next. But I often refer to work that is I've already finished when I'm working on a new piece, and especially looking at the palettes that I use, the colors that I choose. The typical Maine inland landscapes share this sort of palette that's the greens, the dark greens, the pale bluish mountains in the background, the ochres and the yellows are really typical of my Maine paintings. And you see, that's my palette that's on wheels that I roll around, and you can see on the floor the Q-tips and stuff that I've dropped that I use to pick up paint.
Wonderful.
Is next to the large piece, just to the right of it, next to the blank canvas on the other side, is about a 1 foot square painting. Is that the graphite underdrawing that you were talking about earlier?
Actually, no, it's an oil on board. It's a plein air piece that I did out fly fishing. And there's a lot of wiped away white surface underneath it.
I like it.
We can look at the next piece, please. Lovely.
This is an example of my typical Maine in landscape, although this is on the coast of Maine, but those are prominent on my palette when I'm doing Maine landscapes, those colors.
And Hope, have you been here or just feel like you've been there?
I've been here in areas like this. These are the kind of works that in the conservation world, we'd rather put them under a conservation easement to protect the shoreline and the view shed. And Sheepscot is a tidal river, so some of what you're seeing between the rocks and the water is this mossy, seaweedy area that's exposed.
And Mara, this takes you to a place you may or may not have been.
This I can almost smell, the seaweed finger that's sticking out at this point because the tidal. And
Mara, it's a little hard to hear you. I think
oh,
maybe.
sorry. Yeah, I can
Okay, no,
almost smell,
there you go.
can almost smell this painting. I'm trying to fall into that little cove and be there. Also, the delicacy of that background, the melting quality of the paint and the atmospheric and its quality of it. And then this incredibly fast calligraphic 3 tree trunks on the other side. Just, again, it's very deft. It just moves so delicately, and then the foreground just moves so quickly with strength, with good bone, as they would say in China, over it. I'm just totally in love with this. I'm over here on the left-hand side of the painting, and I'm going to stay there.
Yeah, I was thinking more about the design of the rock pattern that pulls your eye down the hill toward the water as well. That there are so many elements of design underneath it that Marguerite's able to see in the landscape and then put into her works that transforms the experience of the landscape into art, and at the same time gives us the experience of being in nature. So that combination or contrast of those worlds, meaning taking that which is in front of us, making it available to others, but at the essence of what it is, rather than simply replicating it with a camera. And this piece seems to me to do it so wonderfully well. Caroline, do you have any thoughts about it?
Yeah, I think this one's a really good example of all the things that we've seen so many pieces that maybe kind of break the rules a little bit, but they're so balanced. Like this piece in particular, it's so visually dense, like you would experience a forest in this area, I assume. It's so dense on the right-hand side, and then this big open sky. And Marguerite doesn't balance it by using the same voice on the right-hand side to, those 2 trees on the left could be, she could just try to throw it in to be heavy to balance it. But instead she uses these really kind of strong lines and these kind of thin trees to create such a balance in a piece that could just be thrown off so easily. And it makes it very musical in a way, and very, very pretty. I think it's really quite a fun and exciting piece. Like Mara keeps saying, they're really fun. They're quite something.
Marguerite, is this your exception where there are buildings through the mist and fog there on the left half of the piece?
Yeah, I was actually going to say that there are actually camps or houses over there on the shore that are almost wiped out by the fog. But yeah, occasionally I have some architecture in my pieces. Not often, but occasionally, yeah.
And let's look at both the cover piece and the last piece of our conversation. We're going to look at it both as the full painting and then as it with some detail to share. But Marguerite, would you begin talking about it?
This piece struck me. It was a view that I saw in the rain, and I loved the denseness of the trees and the kind of amorphic shapes that the trees themselves made. They had vines growing over them, so they became like figures dancing together. But it was all behind a scrim of falling rain, which you'll see in the detail, in which I used the opaque white paint to make the drips in this piece. And then the very dark trees and branches, I think it's just part of my draftsmanship of using lines like that to bring the image to the surface of the canvas. They're right on the surface. You don't get the dense, distant horizon. There is no horizon in this piece, so you don't get that feeling of the distance of space or the deep space. It's pretty much happening on the surface of the painting, which kind of brings it back around to the very early pieces that were flatter and had a lot of action right on the surface of the canvas.
Mara? And let's look at the detail at the same time as Mara speaks, and then we'll come back to this. Thank you.
That was sure. Okay, I asked for the details to sort of blow up so that in some way the people who are out there in Zoom land can start seeing how she builds up her cell color, and then how she builds up this rain technique of drip that you're seeing through rain. You're actually seeing something that's in movement, in motion, that's present but ever changing. That's what happens with rain, or the shift of light. But I love looking at the crotch of the tree over here to the left, in the crotch of the tree, and there's another branch that comes on the diagonal. Just when we have these little.
Oh, Mara, it got hard to hear you again.
Okay.
You're a little, I think, yeah, sorry, there's like a point. You can hear you
There's
there.
a
Yeah,
point,
sorry.
yeah, where I probably moved, whatever. Okay, so just keep correcting me. It's how the little cells of color are built up and how it knits the entire composition together. That I and how her touch varies. You know, the touch of the tree and the sort of calligraphic quickness of the tree with the cell of a color underneath it, and then an overlay of another color, the orangey sienna kind of color that becomes the leaves that you're actually seeing, as opposed to the mist of the bulk of this mass of trees. Just every little cell animates the picture with this, again, a sense of movement, not just of volume, but of movement. And I appreciate the difference of the types of touch that she's using to get to this full canvas. But again, I like to tell people, get your nose right up against it and really see what the hand of the artist is doing and how that paint is moving, and how those qualities of light are being built. Terrific surface work, and with strong structural underpinning.
Hope.
It makes it into, when you zoom in on your own screen into something that's like a 19th century impressionist painting.
Mm.
Otherwise, it's as though I'm looking through a smeared windshield as I'm driving by.
Let's go back to the full canvas if we could. Thank you, Carolyn. And Marguerite, thoughts?
It's interesting that when I first started this painting, I did a graphite drawing underneath it, and I had a totally different vision of what it was going to end up being. And it wasn't this. As I started to work on the piece, it took on its own life, and it just sort of told me what it was going to be. It wasn't what I thought it was going to be. The paint itself did certain things, the drips did them, and then the linear parts of the trees. I wouldn't have visualized it this way when I first started it, but some paintings just do that. Some paintings rather paint themselves, and that's what this one did.
Well, there is a quote of Thomas's somewhat related to this, which is, only those who risk going too far can possibly learn how far one can go. Mm. And I think the notion of remaining open to yourself, both conscious and unconscious, your awareness as you paint, and at the same time allowing the paint to dictate to you, opens new doors and windows to a reality that many of us need to see, and you become our guide. So my sense of the show, and hopefully people will be able to come see the work, or as Mara says, jump into the work, or get very close to the work and experience the paintings themselves. People were in just the other day, and what I did talk to them about was getting close to the work to sense the energy of the brushstroke itself. And I think that as much as we try with these visual representations of the work itself is what the show is about. And hopefully many people will be able to participate in the experience of seeing the world as Marguerite looks back. So I want to thank everyone for being with us, participating with us today, and sharing in this rather extraordinary opportunity to be alerted to the beauty of the world around us. Thank you all for being here. Marguerite,
Thanks.
Hope, Caroline, thank you. Mara, for sure.